There is a kind of name that survives by accident. Not the common ones. Not the surnames that fill entire phone books, spread so wide across centuries that they mean almost nothing on their own. This is about the other kind, the rare ones. The names that appear in a village archive, a ship's manifest, a chapel register, and then almost vanish from history, carried forward by only a handful of families across 500 years. For a long time, these names were treated as curiosities. Interesting maybe, unusual, certainly, but not evidence of anything. Then geneticists started asking a strange question. What if a surname is not just a word passed down through paperwork? What if, in certain cases, it is also a biological thread? What if a name can carry, alongside it, a signature written into the Y chromosome itself? That question turned surnames from a footnote of history into something closer to a genetic record. And when researchers began testing it against real family lines, some of them descending from the age when Europe first reached across oceans, the results did not simply confirm old family legends. They complicated them. They extended them. In a few cases, they revealed something the families themselves had never suspected. This is the story of what happens when a name outlives the century that made it, and what the genome remembers that the paper trail forgot. For most of modern history, a surname was treated as a purely cultural object. It told you where a family came from, what trade an ancestor practiced, sometimes what lord they served. Historians studied surnames the way they study dialects, as clues to migration, not proof of it. A name like a coastal fisherman's trade word, or a rare toponym tied to one specific harbor town, might survive for centuries simply because a handful of families kept using it, generation after generation, largely undisturbed. Genealogists loved these rare names for a simple reason: they were traceable. A common surname could belong to 1,000 unrelated families who happened to adopt the same word. A rare surname, by contrast, often pointed back to a single point of origin, one village, one guild, sometimes one specific family that first carried it into the historical record. This made rare surnames especially interesting to people investigating the age of exploration. Ship manifests, colonial land grants, and mission registries from the 15th through 17th centuries are full of names that appear nowhere else. Basque, Genoese, Portuguese, Cornish, Andalusian names carried onto vessels bound for coastlines their bearers had never seen. Family trees built from these documents suggested, again and again, that certain modern families descended directly from the sailors, navigators, and settlers of that era. It was a tidy story. A name survives, a family tree is built, and the tree seems to confirm what the paperwork already implied. But paperwork has a weakness. It only records what someone chose to write down. The first cracks in this tidy picture came from genealogists themselves, long before DNA entered the conversation. Some family lines with identical rare surnames, tracing supposedly to the same original bearer, did not connect cleanly on paper. Records were missing. Baptismal registers had gaps of 20, 30, sometimes 50 years. In several documented cases, two branches of a family with the same unusual name, both claiming descent from the same 16th century sailor, could not actually be linked through any surviving document. Something did not fit. Either the paper trail was incomplete, which was likely, or the shared name did not mean what everyone assumed it meant. There was a second, quieter problem too. Surnames in this era were not always inherited the way we assume today. Adoption, guardianship, illegitimacy, and the simple practice of taking a patron's name meant that a surname could pass to someone with no biological connection to the person who first carried it. A name could survive perfectly, generation after generation, while the bloodline underneath it quietly changed. If that had happened even occasionally across 5 centuries, then surname-based ancestry, the entire framework genealogists had built their conclusions on, was standing on ground that was not as solid as it looked. This is where genetics entered the story, and where the investigation stopped being about paper and started being about the body itself. The tool that made this possible is the Y chromosome. Unlike most of our DNA, which reshuffles every generation through a process called recombination, the Y chromosome passes from father to son almost unchanged, generation after generation, for thousands of years. It picks up small mutations slowly over long stretches of time, but the core signal stays remarkably stable. And surnames, in most European and colonial naming traditions, also pass from father to son. That overlap is what geneticists call a natural experiment. If a rare surname really does descend from a single 16th century ancestor, then every man alive today who carries that surname, assuming no interruptions in the paternal line, should carry a closely related Y chromosome signature. Not identical. DNA still mutates slowly over centuries. But related. Recognizable. Part of the same deep pattern. Researchers working in genetic genealogy began testing exactly this, comparing Y chromosome markers across men who shared rare, traceable surnames. If you're wondering why this kind of research feels different from ordinary ancestry testing, this is why. It isn't measuring where your ancestors probably came from in general. It's testing whether a specific, named lineage, tied to a specific historical name, actually holds together at the level of the genome. If you find this kind of investigative science compelling, this is a good moment to subscribe, because there is a lot more hidden in the human past than most family trees ever show you. What the early studies found was not a simple yes or a simple no. It was something more interesting than either. In some rare surname groups, the match was striking. Men separated by 4 or 5 centuries, living on different continents, carrying the same unusual name, showed a Y chromosome pattern consistent with true shared paternal descent. The paper trail and the genome agreed. The legend held. But in other cases, and this is where the story widens, the DNA told a different story entirely. Men sharing an identical rare surname, supposedly descended from the same documented ancestor, carried Y chromosome signatures that were not closely related at all. Statistically, some of these men were no more related to each other than 2 strangers pulled off the street. That was not a small inconsistency. That was a signal. It meant that somewhere along the line, sometimes early, sometimes centuries later, the name had detached from the bloodline. A break in the chain. An adoption. An unrecorded remarriage. A name taken on for legal or social reasons that had nothing to do with biology. The surname had survived. The specific ancestral line it claimed had not, or had been joined by others who were never part of the original family at all. The story did not collapse. It widened. Genealogists and geneticists working through this evidence generally point to 3 explanations, and none of them cancels out the others. In most surname lineages, more than one has likely occurred. The first is what researchers sometimes call a non-paternity event, a clinical term for something very human, a child raised under a father's name who was not that father's biological son. Across 500 years and dozens of generations, even a low rate of this occurring compounds. A single break early in a lineage can mean every descendant afterward carries the name without carrying the original bloodline. The second is adoption and guardianship, practices far more common historically than most people realize, especially in colonial and maritime communities where orphaned or abandoned children were frequently absorbed into households and given that household's name, no biological link required. The third is convergent surname origin. The possibility that a name did not begin with a single founder at all, but arose independently in more than one place, from a shared occupational word, a shared village name, or a shared feature of landscape. 2 unrelated families in 2 different regions could end up carrying what looks, on paper, like the exact same rare surname. None of these possibilities makes a family's identity less real. But together, they mean that a shared surname is a claim about culture and memory, not automatically a claim about biology. The turning point in this field came as testing methods improved and researchers gained access to larger comparison panels, deeper Y chromosome marker sets, and broader databases of tested men across multiple countries, rather than small, isolated samples. This mattered enormously because early surname studies were often working with only a handful of participants per name. Larger panels allowed researchers to distinguish a genuinely coherent paternal lineage from a coincidental cluster of unrelated men who simply happened to share a name. And in several of the rarest, most historically loaded surnames, the ones tied specifically to documented ships, ports, and expeditions of the exploration era, the expanded data revealed something researchers had not fully anticipated. Not every surviving branch of these families matched the region their documented ancestors supposedly came from. Some carried a Y chromosome signal consistent with populations far outside Iberia, or Genoa, or the British maritime counties the paperwork pointed to. In a number of documented surname studies, researchers found signals suggesting deeper, older ancestral connections, patterns associated with populations the families had no written record of ever encountering. Not the region the paperwork predicted. Not even the story the family had told itself for generations. The surprise was not that some family trees had gaps. The surprise was what filled them. In certain cases, the genetic signal pointed toward ancestral contact far earlier than the documented expedition itself. Evidence, researchers suggest cautiously, that the name-bearing lineage may have already been shaped by centuries of migration, contact, and mixing long before any ship ever left a European harbor. The exploration-era sailor was not the beginning of the story. He was simply the last, most visible link in a much older chain. This does not prove that every rare explorer's surname hides an ancient secret. Researchers are careful here, and so should we be. What the data shows is not certainty. It is a pattern worth taking seriously, that the neat story of one founder, one voyage, one bloodline, is, in a meaningful number of cases, too small to hold what actually happened. The genome was not erasing these family stories. It was revealing an older, wider one underneath them. This matters beyond any single surname, because it forces a larger and more honest idea about human ancestry. We like our origin stories linear, one founder, one name, one clean line stretching back through time. But the genome does not organize itself that way. It is layered. It absorbs. It carries forward fragments from unions no document ever recorded, alongside the ones that were. Populations, like names, are not pure streams. They are deltas, many currents joining, separating, rejoining over thousands of years. A rare surname surviving 5 centuries is remarkable. But the biology beneath it is often even more remarkable, because it remembers further back than any parish register ever could. Picture, for a moment, the kind of place where a name like this might have been born. A stone harbor on the Atlantic coast, fog rolling low over slate roofs, fishing boats leaning against a seawall built long before anyone thought to write down who built it. Somewhere behind the harbor, a small church holds a register, ink fading, pages brittle, one name appearing and reappearing across a scattering of births and marriages, each entry a small act of memory against forgetting. Stand there long enough, and it becomes clear how easily one entry could break the chain without anyone noticing. A child taken in during a hard winter. A widow remarried within the year. A name given not out of blood but out of belonging. None of it dishonest. All of it human. And all of it now sitting quietly inside a genome, waiting 500 years for a machine sensitive enough to notice. That is the real discovery here. Not that certain families are secretly connected to famous voyages, and not that others are secretly disconnected from them. It is that the line between the two was never as solid as the paperwork made it look. A name is a promise a family makes to remember where it came from. Sometimes DNA confirms that promise exactly as told. Sometimes it reveals that the promise was kept in spirit rather than in blood, that a family absorbed a stranger's child and made him fully their own, and centuries later, that act of belonging is still legible in a laboratory as a genetic signature. Either outcome is a form of continuity. Neither one makes the story smaller. If you carry one of these rare names, the honest answer to, did your bloodline discover new worlds, is rarely a simple yes or no. It is, your name may have. Your biology may agree, or it may point somewhere else entirely, somewhere older, somewhere the paperwork never reached. Both possibilities are extraordinary. Both are part of what it actually means to be descended from people who moved, mixed, adopted, and endured across centuries none of us can fully see. The map our ancestors' names drew for us was never wrong, exactly. It was just smaller than the territory. The genome does not hand us a cleaner map to replace it. It hands us a deeper one with more coastlines, more currents, more unrecorded harbors than any register ever listed. Somewhere in that deeper map is the truth of where your name, and perhaps your blood, actually began. If stories like this interest you, the moments where science quietly rewrites what a family always believed about itself, subscribe because the human past holds far more of these hidden threads than most of us ever get to see.